I also run a meetup like this back home in Turku called Turku's Frontend and a couple of other developer communities. And the reason I'm doing this talk today is that my background as a developer is working in fast-growing startups and as a consultant. And one of the things that is common in both of them is that teams change. Now, when you're listening to this at your home, you can raise your hand if you've been working on the same code base or the same project for at least 2 years now. And keep your hand up if there has been no changes to the team. Nobody has joined and nobody has left. And obviously I cannot see your hands, but from my experience doing this talk, there's not a lot of people who keep their hands up. We work on an industry that is ever changing. Things go fast. The tenure of a developer in a company is rather short. On many places, on average, it's way less than 2 years. So this means that there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of decisions and motivations that are lost in time. Because one of the best things that documentation can do, and what I would say that it should do, is to provide context for the changes that we make. It's not just the documentation of what happens, but especially why it happens. And this applies to any type of documentation. Whether it's your README file or code comments, you should talk about the things that are not kind of reducible from the code. Good code can tell us what it does, but it can never tell us why it does what it does. So for most of the documentation that we use day to day, we want it to be a living organism. It needs to be updated regularly. Nobody wants to see the README or API docs or code comments that are out of date and incorrect. But if we keep everything up to date, we lose a lot of history. And my idea of contemporary documentation is to add a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit to our daily habits, to capture the moment in history and keep it that way. And if we think about what kind of things keep the history intact in our day-to-day, we talk about commit messages on the version control, we talk about the code review, and we talk about stories and tasks. Whatever tools you use for this is irrelevant. I am mostly using terminology from using Git and GitHub and Jira tickets, but you can mentally replace them with the tools that you are using. And the idea here is that I don't want you to take a bunch of new tools, because by the time you go back to work tomorrow, you've already forgotten them. I want to give you some ideas that you can implement tomorrow with just a small percentage change that over time accumulates into a great history of documentation that can really help your team, especially in the future, to figure out what has happened and especially why. So one thing that makes documentation quite difficult is that we don't get the reward right away. When we write a code or we make it pass a test, the computer tells us, good job, something happens. For me, that's one of the biggest reasons why I am a developer. I love to make things happen, and it's a great feeling when the computer does what I tell it to do. But when I think about documentation, process done on GitHub pull requests. Or it might be patch notes on email. Whatever it is, write everything down. Because in 2 years, you're not gonna remember them. And you might not be there anymore. Ask a lot of questions. I was talking to some students yesterday about code reviews. And the key thing I told them is, code review is not a judgment process. It's not a process of a senior developer telling somebody what they did wrong. It's an opportunity for the entire team to learn about the code base, to discuss the changes, and to stay up to date what's happening with the code base. Once the code is committed, it's shared code with the team. Nobody owns it anymore, individually. So, ask a lot of questions. If there's something you don't understand, how it works, or why it's done like that, ask it. And write the question and the comment, the answer, down somewhere. And when things are resolved or answered, don't delete the comments. Tools like GitHub has a really nice functionality that you can resolve discussions. So it hides them from the pull request, so you can focus on the things that haven't been fixed. But if you go back to them, you can still find all of them. Keep the history intact. It's not just a temporary discussion. It's contemporary, and it should stay in the history of project. And then the third part is the stories, tasks, bug reports, tickets, whatever you use and however you call them. This is one of the places where I see most opportunities for improvement. And one of the key things to document here is the origin and the business driver of these changes, or the need for the change. Because like I mentioned earlier, it's really scary to delete or change code, because you don't know if it's needed anymore. If a project has a lifetime of, let's say, 10 years, there's gonna be things that are gonna be kind of become unnecessary. But if we don't record the original need and the business reason, it's gonna be impossible to know. And then, just for the sake of safety, we keep everything in the code base. For any kind of bug, I recommend steps for how to reproduce. That also helps in the future if something similar comes up later. It helps to figure out if this is the same thing that somehow reappeared, or if it's a new thing. And related to that, the definition of done. What are the boundaries of this change? And these three things together form a really good basis. But this is just the starting point. And once again, ask questions. Quite often the things are how these things come together using Git and GitHub and GitHub issues. Since most of the code that I work in Teams is under NDA, this is kind of a mock example. Don't pay too much attention on the code. It's total nonsense. So let's say that you come to a project, or you see this code on your Python. You see some kind of a sum function that takes a couple of numbers. And then there's something that rings a bell to you, like, this doesn't look like the sum that I'm used to. What was taught to me at school is A plus B. But now I see something completely different. There's probably a good reason. I trust that the developer who did it a couple of years ago had a good reason. But they're gone. So what do I do? First, I can use git blame. I can use it on command line. A lot of editors and IDEs have this built in, or with an extension. And I can find the commit that introduced this line of code. I can copy the hash of the commit. I can go to GitHub into the repository, and I can search for that hash. And it gives me a commit that says what the name the commit message headline is. I can click that, and I will end up to see the changes and also the commit message. So we have some explanation here, but circled in red, you can also see from which pull request did this commit come from. So I can start from the commit message, and then I can go into the pull request. And since this is just the mock example, I don't have a review, I don't have comments, but at this point you could see what was discussed a couple of years ago. This change was done in 2019, and now, 2021, coming back to it, I could see what was happening, what was the motivation, what kind of discussion did the team have about this change. And since in this case I'm using GitHub issues, in the pull request, I can say which tickets does it fix or close. And I can click to them, and I can see the business reason. And I can see the discussion about the origins of this change. So for example, in this case, I would be able to then see that these aliens are no longer served by the company. So we don't actually need this anymore. And it's safe to change if we need to change it. And this is the way I often work. If I get a bug report, if I need to start fixing can find me on Twitter at Juha-Matti. I will post the slides on Twitter after this. I will also share them in Py.Amsterdam Slack. You can find more about me on my website. I write a weekly blog about technology and communities. And if you want to get in touch after the event, you can use Twitter or reach me out via an email. And I also run a monthly developer newsletter called Dev Breakfast. If you want to get some interesting articles curated by my colleagues every last Friday of the month, fresh to your inbox, while you enjoy the morning breakfast. Thanks. And I think there's been a couple of comments on YouTube. So the first one comes from Marc-André, who says that unfortunately tools like GitHub nudge developers into one-line commit messages. And yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of recommendations and ways of working that indeed does that. It like a lot of guides and tutorials about using Git say that hey, you can do full Git message, commit message with git-m or git commit-m. And it took me a long time to kind of change my habits. Then we have a comment about Quit Squash. So they returned to the project after 2 years, found out 80% of the commit messages are gone. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that either. So when you have kind of work in progress commits, squashing them before the code review, that's a great idea. But basically removing the history once you have good commits, not a big fan. And Alexander comments that he also, the fear of deleting code, that's something we all have to live with. Making it easier for other people, the future you, the future teammates, and future people working on the code base. And yeah, there's a couple of reasons why it's scary. One is that if you don't have tests, you don't know what breaks. But also, even if it's not something that breaks the code, but you don't know if it's needed. I'm a big proponent of deleting all the code that is unnecessary. Like, the less code we have, less problems we have.
Thank you, Juhis. That was a really nice talk. Sorry, I think I was offline for a minute. I had a problem with my Chrome. So yeah, thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions. If there is more questions, I don't know if anyone. There is some delay, so with the
we can wait for a moment.
Yeah, let's do that.
And also, if something comes up later, I will be in the Py.Amsterdam Slack, so feel free to comment there, and we can have good discussions about best practices. Like all the things, all the ideas that we present in these meetups are just that they are one view of things and ideas, and I'm super happy to also hear kind of conflicting ideas and different ways that all of you have found out the good ways to do these kind of things in your teams.
Cool. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn your screen share off. I was losing Jan, so I don't see Jan in the video. So something wrong is happening with our system. But I want to say thank you, everyone. Thank you, Juhis. I think it was super nice. So we have some people saying thanks, sending some thanks in the chat. I don't have anyone, so that's bad news, because I think it's going to be the first time that we don't have lightning talks. So yeah, I hope next time we have some we have someone proposing that, and we can be back to having the best part of our meetup. So
I can say from experience that lightning talks are super fun to do. It's the easiest way to get started with meetup talks and conferences. At least for me, it's one of the best moments of any conference when we get to do lightning talks.
yeah, that's true. And I think you were giving a lightning talk like a year ago here, and now you're a speaker. So thank you very much. That's super nice to have. Cool. So Jan is back. I think we are ready to say goodbye. I want to say thank you to everyone that was following us on YouTube. Remember, you can join using this QR that you have here. You can join our Slack and keep the discussion going. And yeah, so I hope we can see each other in Amsterdam soon. I don't know, Jan, if you want to say anything else.
No, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining in tonight. We had quite many people, so I hope you enjoy this. And don't forget to go to Py.Amsterdam and submit your ideas for your talks. And if you don't like our website, you are welcome to help us update it. So you can go to our GitHub repository and submit your pull request.
Yeah, and next time, thank you very much. Have a really nice evening. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.